This is a journey across a magnificent continent. It's a journey through space and time. Along the way, we discover the traces of ancient oceans and unearth the remains of tropical rainforests way up high in the mountains. Dinosaurs join us as traveling companions. We meet up with Neanderthals and are on hand to witness a cosmic accident that came close to obliterating everything. We encounter hunters and the hunted, and join Europe on its long journey around our planet. A 100 years ago, people were already aware of certain mysterious ancient animals. Again and again, evidence of a much earlier Germany surfaced, a place inhabited by strange creatures. This was just such a find from those prehistoric times. Bone from a legendary animal. The age of the dinosaur had dawned. They would now call the shots for the next 150 million years. Compared to its later relations, the Plateosaurus was a featherweight. Yet this herbivore was still too heavy for the damp, muddy ground of the swamplands that had spread over the area bit by bit. The thick, gooey silt swallowed them up like quicksand. In modern times, so many of the longnecks were unearthed here that they were nicknamed Swabian lintworms after the local region. These creatures marked the beginning of the story of the dinosaurs. The bone was only the tip of the iceberg. But let's first take a big step back. Young Earth was still a glowing ball of fire. No sign yet of our blue planet. Little by little, the red-hot Earth cooled down. Rivers, lakes, and oceans appeared. At the time, the primeval precursor of Europe was rising up from the sea. The continent lay thousands of kilometers farther south, at the equator. Nowadays, this distant era is known as the Carbon or Coal Age. Back then, there was a strange atmosphere in the forest. Birds did not yet exist. The climate was hot and humid. There was a surplus of oxygen. Higher, further, longer. The fern trees grew to heights up to 20 meters. Prehistoric giant centipedes could reach lengths of up to 2 meters. Chordates were the first vertebrates to set foot on terra firma. Within just a few million years, these amphibians had developed legs and lungs. And for the first time, animals took to the air. Giant dragonflies patrolled from above, with 4 individually controllable wings. Like their modern ancestors, they were high-precision hunters. The ancient tropical forests produced enormous amounts of oxygen. One thunderclap was enough to cause the explosive air mixture to combust. At this stage, Europe was situated at the intersection of 2 vast landmasses. The collision of the two gave rise to a mountain range that could have been as high as the modern-day Alps, if it hadn't begun to crumble as soon as it had formed. The forest swamplands were buried beneath the debris of the mountains. Forests repeatedly grew up, only to be flooded once again by the ocean waters and covered with sand and rocky debris, a process that took millions of years. Cut off from oxygen, the plants didn't rot. First, they became peat, then lignite or brown coal, and finally, black coal. The run-up to modern coal mining began 700 years ago in England. On the surface at first, then, in pursuit of the deeper layers, operations went underground. The energy originally stored in the plants was once again brought to light. The great hunger for energy literally undermined the coal mining towns. The ground below was soon crisscrossed with mine shafts and passageways. Meanwhile, above ground, coal-fired power plants were being built. These installations convert fossil combustibles into energy, the stuff that growth and progress is made of. On the coal mine slag heaps, the primeval forest from down below once again becomes visible. Its remains can be seen in the fine outlines that the giant specimens have left behind in the coal strata. The huge fern trees have been immortalized in stone, as well as giant centipedes. The trunks of 40-meter-tall sigillaria trees have also made their mark. So too the dragonflies, which, apart from their huge size, are hardly distinguishable from today's version. The blueprint of the magnificent dragonfly has hardly changed in millions of years. During growth, the young insect repeatedly casts off its extremely lightweight yet durable chitinous exoskeleton. Beneath this disposable armor, its body is divided into soft segments, After the last shedding, it finally spreads its wings. The dragonfly has reached maturity. The descendants of the caudate have not reinvented themselves either. They still spend their childhood in the water, breathing through gills. Later on, they grow legs and lungs. Only then can they go on land. It's almost like watching evolution in fast motion. In prehistoric Central Europe, a massive mountain range once stood here, where now only dwarves remain. Erosion has worn the Coal Age mountain range down to the ground. As the peaks eroded, their debris filled the valleys. What remains are the low mountain ranges of southern, eastern, and western Europe, the Sudides, the Rhenish Massif, and the Ardennes. Water often collected in the clay containing watertight strata of the valley floors, creating lakes. Looking at the green landscape of today, it's hard to imagine that a primordial ocean once sloshed here. The Zechstein Sea covered a large part of the European continent, from today's Baltic states, across Poland, and all the way to the Netherlands. There was still no sign that a disaster of incomparable proportions would occur in the post-Carbon Age era. Temperatures on land were scorching. Though they were left high and dry, the amphibians didn't go extinct. Those that escaped the arid land into the water lived on and continued to adapt. Rain clouds that developed out at sea rarely reached the interior of the landmass. Without rain, vast desert regions came into being. With skin and eggs that are resistant to evaporation, the reptiles now had a decisive advantage in the hot desert climate. Over a period of 150 million years, mountain ranges were ground down, flooded by the ocean, then left to dry out again. What remained was a landscape of dusty valleys cut through with deep rivers and streams. Mud skippers found their own ingenious way of gaining solid ground. Instead of lungs, they developed gill chambers, which they fill with water that they repeatedly enrich with oxygen by gasping for air. Mud skippers are not the link between fish and the four-legged creatures on land. Rather, they are proof that for almost every challenge, there are several solutions. It can take hundreds of millions of years for a given animal to make the transition from water to land. Crabs have also made the leap. At low tide, they search the sand for food. As diverse and ingenious as plant and animal adaptations may be, nature is nevertheless repeatedly sent back to the drawing board. By the end of the Permian period, 80% of all animal species on land and in the sea had gone extinct. It is highly probable that a series of volcanic eruptions triggered their demise. The climate descended into chaos. Algae blooms and oxygen-eating bacteria created death zones in the oceans, poisoning all marine life. Throughout the Earth's history, mass die-offs of this kind have repeatedly led to the loss of entire animal groups. Even today, evidence of the prehistoric deserts is still omnipresent. In the Palatinate forest on the Franco-German border, sand and clay deposits have piled up to form 400-meter thick layers. Once, the colorful sandstone also filled all the valleys, covering the entire Palatinate forest. But wind and water have since eroded a major portion of the highly porous sedimentary stone, creating bizarre rock formations. And the Palatinate forest isn't the only one in Europe that's changed. Across the continent, the giant fern trees have been replaced by other species: spruce, beech, oak, and pine. At first glance, this sea of trees seems empty and monotone, yet it's actually full of life and surprises. In the south of the continent, Mediterranean pine forests carpet the land. In Central and Eastern Europe, it's beech. And in the north, the taiga takes over. But though these forests might seem untouched, they ceased being real wilderness a very long time ago. Here, forestry and modern hunting shape the face of nature. White stork is one of the original inhabitants of the alluvial forests. Initially a tree breeder, the birds first took to the rooftops and chimneys when human beings began to shape the landscape. And yet, since time immemorial, the forest has remained an enchanted place, shrouded in mystery. The deep, dark woods are a primary source of legends and fairy tales. At night, we can still feel the spirit of the primeval forest. In some places, however, the dream of the ancient forest has become a nightmare. For centuries, the prehistoric carbon stored in the Carbon Age forests has been rising into the atmosphere from smokestacks and chimneys, fueling climate change as well as industry. But rows of spruce have also been planted at some spots, creating fragile forest plantations. Powerful winter storm, however, sweeping through here and pulling up trees by the roots can often devastate whole woodland areas. When such natural disasters strike, we can only look on helplessly as years of reforestation efforts are toppled. In the Bavarian Forest National Park, they have established what are called forest cells, designated areas where fallen trees are left untouched. The forest is purposely left to its own devices. Here, it's open season for pests. The voracious bark beetle can go about its destructive work undisturbed. The beetles lay their eggs in the wood, and when they hatch, the gluttony begins. Like a biblical plague, the insects ravage the spruce forest. But every ending bears the seeds of a new beginning. However, unintentionally, the pernicious pest actually helps give birth to a new, wilder, and more colorful world. Fungi contribute by decomposing the dying timber to create the virgin forest of the future. With the naked eye, we can't even see the growth of mushrooms that shoot up from the ground virtually overnight. So it is all the more difficult to comprehend the slow pace at which life turns to stone. What looks like a standstill is in fact a state of constant change. Entire continents migrate, animal and plant species vanish, and new ones appear. But in our perception, the time spans are so enormous that we can only guess at the extent of the changes. The events of millennia can be compressed into just a few centimeters of stone. At a rock quarry in Bavaria, evidence of prehistory is revealed. As the layers are excavated, silent witnesses from a bygone age repeatedly come forward. Back then, the region rested at the edge of a sea with flat lagoons along the shoreline. Underwater, coral reefs lined the coast. But above the waterline, things were getting restless. Welcome to Europe's Jurassic Park. In the Jurassic period, the dinosaurs had the run of the planet. Skillful flyers, quick hunters, and armored giants, they conquered almost every niche, every habitat. On the islands, which are mountains today, live speedy predatory dinos, like this Compsognathus, who like to eat his smaller relations. This savage age gave birth to a strange creature with clawed fingers and a long, bony tail, Archaeopteryx. The first evidence of Archaeopteryx was discovered in 1860 in a chalk quarry in the little Bavarian town of Solnhofen. A feather. Soon the first fossilized skeleton was found, a feathered dinosaur. A bird? The finds gave rise to new questions. Charles Darwin had just published his theory on the origin of species. Soon the fossil was caught in an evolutionary tug-of-war. One camp saw it as evidence that birds came from dinosaurs. For others, it was an exotic anomaly, but definitely not a link between species. They were wrong. Every layer of Solnhofen limestone could bring a new fossil to light and cause a new stir. A discovery no one had reckoned with. Archaeopteryx wasn't the first dino to wear feathers. But if the little predatory dinosaurs' plumage wasn't airworthy, why did they have it? Nowadays, reptiles are cold-blooded. They sunbathe to store up warmth. Dinosaurs were believed to do the same, but the Jurassic creatures left nothing more than stone to go by. But the stone has tales to tell, if you know how to extract them. Sometimes very fine structures are preserved deep within the fossils. At Bonn University, researchers are looking at these microstructures. In the bones of the big herbivore dinosaurs, the scientists have discovered growth rings, similar to those of trees. The core samples from the bones show that in many dinosaurs, the rings are spaced at large intervals. They must have grown quickly, as only warm-blooded creatures do. And so, history must now once again be rewritten. At least several species of dinosaur had little in common with modern reptiles. Feathered, two-legged dinos that warm their eggs with their bodies and feed their young. The similarity is no coincidence. The golden eagle, here on the lookout for prey, is a descendant of the dinosaur. Likewise, blackbird and sparrow. The eagle's habitat looks wizened, weather-beaten, full of wrinkles, as old as can be. The appearance is deceptive. The Alps are a relatively young mountain range that a mere 200 million years ago was still underwater. Today, traces of the former ocean are still encased in the alpine Dachstein limestone. The mysterious imprints in the Dachstein Massif long posed puzzling questions. These are the descendants of the inhabitants of a warm ocean, from which the Alps had yet to rise up. Back then, much of the alpine region still looked like a tropical underwater seascape. In the south, a deep trench separated the African and European continents. The sea filled this divide, and the beaches were lined with reefs up to 1,000 meters tall. The smaller inhabitants of this sea had to beware of marine dinosaurs. Even in the dark, the alpine reef was not a safe place. Nowadays, that sea lies above the clouds. The seabed crumpled up into a mountain range. Once 1,000 kilometers across, it was pushed together like a concertina and is now just 100 kilometers wide. The craggy mountain landscape is the result of a collision of the two continents. Here, Africa pressed from the south against Europe. Unbelievably slowly, the Earth's crust splintered, crumbled, and piled up in layers. And so, from the bottom of an ancient ocean, the chalk Alps grew to great heights. The ancient seabed has turned to rock cliff, from which water comes crashing down in free fall. The constant force of the water wears the mountain away again, bit by bit. Daddy longlegs, or harvestmen, have survived for millions of years and are eyewitnesses to these changes. Now, many species are under threat. Human beings are encroaching on their habitats. The underwater world of the alpine lakes is no less mysterious than the prehistoric oceans. Here, too, evolution has come up with a highly inventive survival strategy. These clear but nutrient-poor lakes are home to the bladderwort. This ancient aquatic plant has a special way of meeting its dietary needs. To get enough nitrogen, the bladderwort supplements its diet with little crabs and worms. The tiny animals are trapped and then slowly digested in the bladder of the carnivorous plant. In the dinosaur age, the prehistoric precursor of the pike could also be found chasing through the waters. "600 meters above today's sea level lies the Königssee. Here the pike and the bladderwort hunt along the remains of coral banks and reefs that were lifted up to altitudes far above the timberline. In just a few million years, the habitat has been transformed, and with it, the animal and plant kingdoms. Living at an altitude of 1,000 meters, the marmot is perfectly adapted for the alpine climate. Unlike some other mammals, marmots are unable to pant to cool their bodies down. In a warmer climate, they would not survive the rigors of the constant turf wars. But how do species develop? How does evolution get down to business? While the Alps slowly rose up, a new and colorful revolution began. Flowering plants came to be, and with them, insects, some of them specially adapted to a single type of flower. If one did not exist, the other could not survive. The insects are attracted to the nutrition, and by pollinating the buds, they, in turn, ensure the creation of the next generation of flowering plants. No one yet knows exactly how this interplay of mutual adaptation all began. It's a rugged world up here. The high mountain habitat is particularly harsh. With every meter of altitude, the temperature drops and the diversity of plant life decreases. But the plants that do manage to survive up here, despite extremes of cold, sun, and aridity, are true specialists. In this inhospitable realm, where almost no tree species can exist today, the Swiss pine thrives. They take their time growing and can live for up to 1,000 years. With their sinuous trunks and tough wood, they defy the storms and icy winds that often haunt these heights. The fate of the nutcracker is inextricably linked to that of the pines. Year for year, this little feathered descendant of the dinosaur painstakingly gathers pine cones. In the fall, a single bird stows his stash in up to 6,000 hiding places. When winter comes, it returns to its storehouses. It can remember where most of them are, but not all. Many of the seeds in the forgotten caches sprout in spring, allowing new trees to grow. So the nutcracker doesn't just feed at the bountiful table of the Swiss pine. It also ensures the species' continued existence. A delicate balance of nature at the edge of the timberline. What was once the ocean floor is now the preserve of acrobats. Under the watchful eye of the eagle, the young chamois blaze new trails. But as skillful as they are at climbing, falling rock and avalanches repeatedly take their toll, especially on the kids. The eagles are immediately on the scene. Ibex and chamois risk their daredevil stunts on the precipitous rocky mountainsides in search of an essential substance, salt. On the journey of the continent northwards from the equator, the sun dried out the shallow seas, turning them to salt deserts. The Permian period oceans also left their traces here in the far south of Germany. Today, those salt strata traverse the rock of the Berchtesgaden Alps. The salt rock veins extend kilometers deep into the mountains, and at some spots are up to 1,000 meters thick. As the Alps began to elevate, the salt deposits too were lifted out of the depths, becoming deformed as they were displaced. Their patterns clearly delineate the uplift of the mountain range. Salt has been extracted in Berchtesgaden for almost 500 years. The drills follow the salt veins in the mountain. From the tunnels, mine shafts extend deep down into the salt rock. The mountain water itself does the actual extraction, washing the salt out of the stone. The brine is almost as salty as the water of the Dead Sea. The ancient cycle repeats itself. Water evaporates and precious salt remains. Hundreds of millions of years have left their mark in the rocks, giving Europe its ever-changing appearance. During this time, the Alps have grown to become a massive mountain range. Their peaks are the highest point of today's Europe. And the Alpine Massif still continues to push upwards. But where there is a mountain range, there will also be constant assaults by frost, wind, and water. If it weren't for erosion, the Alps would be 30 kilometers high by now. Every trickle carries the mountaintop down to the valley, pebble by pebble. The precursor to the Mediterranean once covered vast areas of the earth. It was from this early ocean that the Alps arose, creating a river that now flows through 6 European countries, the Rhine. Its story begins 50 million years ago. Its source is in Switzerland, high above sea level. On the descent, winding its way through valleys, the Rhine makes an enormous drop in altitude. The Alpine Rhine carries along with it sand and detritus, the rubble of the eroding mountain range. Several million tons of it each year. It's all deposited little by little in Lake Constance. The river is thus filling a depression left behind by Ice Age glaciers. Lake Constance itself was cut into the land by glacial ice stream tongues. When they retreated, they left behind the large meltwater lake surrounded by high walls of rocky rubble. When the dams burst, the Alpine Rhine made its way westwards to join the still young Upper Rhine. At the Rhine Falls near Schaffhausen, Switzerland, the second largest waterfall in Europe, up to 700 cubic meters of water a second come crashing down. For the river's fish, the upstream journey ends here, except for the eel. Its roots go back millions of years. From the evolutionary perspective, the eel is an old model, but one that is by no means outdated. It can leave its element to get past the Rhine Falls via the land route. It's thought that the reign of the dinosaurs came to an abrupt end 65 million years ago with a meteorite strike, but that wasn't really the end of their story. Its claws are only faintly reminiscent of the predatory dinosaurs of the Jurassic and Cretaceous periods. Yet the dipper is one of their living descendants. In fact, all birds are distant relations to the next. As everything in the development of life, this transformation too was likely a process peppered with intermediate forms and transitions. Just past Schaffhausen, the Rhine flows on into Germany, along the edge of the Black Forest. Woodlands famed far beyond the national borders. The shade of the mountain conifer is home turf for the wood grouse. The male is no flying ace, but he does boast impressive plumage. This shows the female that her suitor would be a healthy partner. The offspring of these animals will be a tiny bit different from their parents. Those who pass on their characteristics to the next generation will define conditions in their environment. The way of the world for 4 billion years now. It worked. The females are all aflutter now. Some members of the plant kingdom have also survived the Earth's major mass die-offs. The first conifers appeared way back in the Carbon Age coal forests. The silver fir is one of their ancestors. Up to 65 meters tall, they grow in the hilly regions of Central and Southern Europe. These trees are a living example of tricks that evolution has employed to great success since time immemorial. The generation of protected, nutrient-rich seeds and airworthy pollen, and all on one tree. The source of the Wutak River is in the south of the Black Forest. Over millions of years, the tireless power of the water has slowly exposed the rock strata. The river cuts through the history of Europe, right down to the foundation stone of the Carbon Age mountain range. The environment is ever-changing. The view from above the Black Forest down into the Rhine Valley is like a window on the Earth's interior. Here, a continent was divided. To the west, the Rheingraben, or trench, opened up as a branch of the ocean, cut across Germany. 50 million years ago, when southern Central Europe was pushed up by the pressure of the Alps, the ocean retreated, leaving behind the upper Rhine. The river chose an unsettled bed. The Earth's crust is especially thin here. Magma repeatedly made its way to the surface. Millennia of erosion have sanded down the prehistoric volcanic craters. What remains are the sun-drenched terraced slopes of the Kaiserstuhl, a little bit of Tuscany on the upper Rhine. The extinct volcanoes are a fertile ground for many life forms. A jungle of grasses and flowers provide good camouflage for an unusual hunter, the praying mantis. It's mating season, and the female is hungry. The lizard is completely unfazed by the deadly rendezvous. Unlike its ancestors, millions of years ago. This collision put an end to the age of the dinosaurs. crash hurled huge amounts of dust into the Earth's atmosphere. The sun was hidden for months on end. Temperatures dropped significantly. More than half of all species were wiped out. Scientific debate over whether the meteorite strike alone caused the dinosaurs' demise will most likely rage on and on. But one thing is certain: the time for the mammals had come. In the shadow of the dinosaurs, the first mammals appeared, little unassuming creatures. With the giant reptiles out of the picture, the way was now clear for them. Welcome to the Rhine River floodplain of the Eocene Age. It is 10 million years after a comet impact has devastated our planet, and Europe has migrated farther north. In the subtropical climate, mammals have come to dominate the scene. Here, where later the Riesling grape will grow, we now find a lush, primeval rainforest. Half of all known modern-day mammalian groups are already in existence here. Birds, fish, and insects too. The entire animal kingdom is almost the same as the present-day edition. Not the European one, however. Nowadays, many of the Eocene inhabitants live in the tropical regions of South America and Asia. It's thanks to a volcano that we know exactly which animals lived here back then. When the volcano erupted 48 million years ago, a 300-meter deep crater lake was formed. Plants and animals were swept down deep into the depths, but instead of being destroyed, they were preserved intact in oil shale. The Messel Pit, near the city of Darmstadt in Germany. Here, layer for layer, a snapshot of a major event and geological history is being excavated. The fossil record tells of life and death at the crater lake. Most likely, poisonous gases bubbling up from below had escaped the water, causing animals to asphyxiate, fall into the lake, and drown. Many fossilized bats have been found. They must have swooped down too close to the water surface. Today, the Messel Pit is a UNESCO World Heritage Site and a unique gateway to prehistoric Europe. The oldest extant hand of a primate was found here. The fossil finds in Messel are astonishingly true-to-life imprints of the animals. Shadows of skin, as well as hair and plumage, are depicted. Sometimes the stomach contents have even been preserved. The most spectacular find to date was made back in the 1980s. A 60-centimeter-long monkey-like animal with a very long tail. The creature had most likely fallen prey to the same poisonous gases as the other animals discovered in the shale. "47 million years later, the little lady primate caused quite a stir. now known as Ida, she was long billed as the progenitor of the human race. Although no definitive evidence for this was ever produced, her body does display one of evolution's greatest innovations: gripping hands with opposable thumbs. The tropical Eocene forest, too, was eventually buried beneath the layers of time. Now, whenever we scratch the surface, a glimpse of prehistory is revealed. Here, where the diggers now scoop the last lignite out of the ground, virgin forests once lined a long coastline. Slumbering beneath the lignite are tons of amber. Frozen in time within it, the life of the ancient forests. Much of Western Europe was now being covered over with a fresh layer of ice. Coming down from Scandinavia, the glaciers pushed all the way to London. Coming from the Alps, they made it to the Chiemsee in Bavaria. The glaciers formed and displaced earth and rock and bound so much water that vast areas of the North Sea were drained. The Quaternary, the most recent geological period, was a time of upheaval. There were repeated glacier thaws, with the meltwater runoff cutting deep gullies into the land. As the cold retreated northwards, the animals of the cold periods disappeared. Forests spread out again. Hippopotamus, elephants, and rhinoceros migrated from the south to the once again green habitats. Roe deer lived in the immediate vicinity of the elephants and the tributaries of the original Rhine. Forest elephants now lived where mammoth had previously grazed, and roe deer and wild boar came along to take the place of reindeer. The animals migrated in accordance with the changing climate. But something significant had changed. The animals were no longer alone. In October 1907, laborer Daniel Hartmann made an astonishing find: my friends. Today I done found Adam. Just days later, an anthropologist visited the sandpit. For 20 years, the researcher had been paying the workers to excavate bones for him. His patience and his investment had finally paid off.
Where exactly did you find him?
Over yonder in the steep face.
So did you thoroughly search a spot?
Uh-huh.
And did you find any more of them?
This here. That, and this.
Uh-huh.
The mandible belonged to a precursor of the Neanderthal. It was given the name Homo Heidelbergensis. The age of man had begun. Long before the first human beings appeared in Europe, the Middle Rhine was formed. The Alps applied pressure from the south, creating the central German uplands. Then, 25 million years ago, the ocean retreated from the rising mountain range, leaving the Middle Rhine behind. It didn't hook up with the Upper Rhine until 10 million years later. Much later still, human beings came along to make their unrelenting mark on the landscape. During the century of industrialization, the Rhine, as many other European rivers, was straightened along its entire length, reshaping entire regions. The Romans brought the art of winemaking along with them to the south of France, to Germany, to Italy, and to Spain. They laid the foundation for the triumph of Riesling, Merlot, and Cabernet. Although the landscape along the Rhine doesn't suggest it, people here live closer to the Earth's blowholes than they know. On the river island Namandayavad, a water sprout shoots up to heights of up to 60 meters, the highest cold water geyser on Earth. Not far from the geyser lies an old crater lake, the Lacharsee. In the Middle Ages, an order of Benedictine monks retreated to the seclusion of the lake. They built a monastery and called it Maria Lach. But the monks didn't suspect that they were living closer to the brink of hell than to heaven. The extinguished fire mountains in the Eifel region of Germany can reignite at any moment, as can the supervolcanoes of Italy. No one can say if it will be in 10,000 years or next Tuesday. The last time the Maria Lach volcano erupted, the result was destruction of unimaginable proportions. The ash spread as far as southern Sweden and northern Italy. For several days, avalanches of hot lava and ash barreled through the valleys, creating an almost 30-meter-high wall that dammed up the Rhine and Mosel rivers for weeks on end. When the dam finally burst, a gigantic torrent of floodwater went crashing downstream, all the way to the Netherlands, laying waste to everything in its path. Long before this devastation, an ancestor of today's human beings had lived throughout a large part of Europe and the Middle East. Homo Neanderthalensis, the Neanderthal. More than 200,000 years ago, this species of human had already developed in Europe. In the coldest periods, the advancing glaciers had forced the Neanderthal to up sticks and move on. Finally, however, the species succeeded in adapting to the cold. The Neanderthal was long assumed to have been inferior to modern man in almost every way. Not so. Neanderthals knew how to find the safest hideouts and the best hunting grounds. They were skillful craftsmen. They tanned hides and fashioned clothing out of leather and fur. The Neanderthals lived in small clans, scattered across a large area. But even in the forests of the warmer periods, survival wasn't easy. The dense woods were home not only to deer, rhinoceros, and forest elephants, but to lions and hyenas as well. As the climate changed, so too did the habitat. But the Neanderthals continued to adapt and survive. Nothing is known about their language, but the anatomy of their throat reveals they would certainly have been able to communicate vocally. Their hunting implements were already far more advanced than those of Homo Heidelbergensis. They used a sort of glue made of birch tar to fasten their knife-sharp flint blades to their spears. A brilliant invention. Evidence shows that Neanderthals cared for their sick and buried their dead. There is still much speculation over why they eventually vanished from the face of the earth 30,000 years ago. We were long thought to descend from the victors over these primitives, but apparently not all encounters between the two were hostile. The fact is, we do share a portion, albeit a small one, of our genetic material with them. The Neanderthal lives on within us. For the last time to date, a great cold period had northern Europe in its grip. Now the wolves and the large grazers, mammoth, musk oxen, and reindeer wandered in their millions over the wide open spaces. At the foot of the glaciers, a constant wind swept across the land. It was the northernmost outpost of life. When the cold here got too severe, the herds had to move on. The wolves were always hot on their heels. And they weren't the only ones following the herds. In the midst of the cold period, human beings immigrated from the African savanna to what is now Central Europe. For days on end, the hunter roamed the ice desert, searching for fresh meat for his clan. Wolves were among the first wild animals that humans not only hunted, but domesticated as well. The life of the hunters was dictated by the migration of the herds. As the animals changed feeding grounds, the human predators, too, repeatedly moved camp along the great migration routes. In the summertime, the open steppe was a fruitful hunting ground, but it was almost impossible to track animals in winter, when the snow and wind covered their trail, and they disappeared against the white backdrop. Every year, the hunters waited for their prey to pass by on migration. But the great herds slowly began to disappear, never to return again. Some species went completely extinct. Others left the land of the Ice Age hunters. For a long time, human beings took the rap for the disappearance of the mammoth and the megalosaurus. But the handful of hunters can't be responsible for the extinction of these species. Rising temperatures seemed the more plausible answer for the animal's demise. The end of the Ice Age was the start of a geological restart process, because only after the glaciers melted could northern Europe begin to become the place we know today. The scope and character of the North Sea changed radically. It advanced farther and farther to the south, flooding the vast plains of the former glacier regions. A completely new habitat was born, the Wadden Sea. Fine-grained sand, gray-brown mud, and turbid water as far as the eye can see. That's about all the North Sea has to offer. And yet, the ice desert of yore has become a richly diverse habitat. Twice a day, the tides flood the Wadden Sea with a nutrient-rich brew. The mud offers both protection and food. Beneath the surface of the mud flats, there is an abundance of life. This is the nursery for many fish that will grow up to live in the North Sea. The lumpfish too spawns here. The male goes all out to protect the spawn. After all, it's not his survival, but that of his offspring that will secure the survival of the species. After the eggs have hatched, the larvae remain for some time in the safety of the shallow waters before they swim out to sea. The cadavers of the father fish, dead of exhaustion, often wash ashore. In the spring and fall, millions of migratory birds make a rest stop at the Wadden Sea. The area has the largest bird population in Central Europe. The Ice Age created an island of life. Far offshore, the North Sea becomes quite rough. Amidst blustering waves, the island of Helgoland rises up from the sea. Around 250 million years ago, the Red Island was still part of a desert. It's the only port of call, far and wide for passing air travelers in need of a rest. Once a year, the cliffs of Helgoland offer countless visiting seabirds, a perfect place to rear their young. In the winter, long after the migratory birds have left the island, gray seals appear on the beach. The bulls compete aggressively for the best spots, trying to conquer the section of beach where the sea cows gather to await the birth of their young. Soon after the young are born, the gray seal mating season begins. One after the other, the bulls come ashore, vying for ascendancy in the fight for procreation. In the winter, winds churn the sea. Sharp tongues of surf lash away at the cliffs and the beach, carrying off rock and sand and depositing it elsewhere. The work of human hands attempts to stem the process. Along the Baltic Sea coast, things are much quieter. Here, where the Ice Age has scooped out a basin and filled it with its meltwater to create the Baltic Sea, a broad belt of reed marshes and sand flats has developed, neither land nor water. Free of human intervention, large parts of the Baltic Sea shoreline are sanctuaries for coastal wildlife. The broad belts of marshland are the preserve of the marsh harrier that broods and rears its young on the ground. The chalk cliffs of Rügen are also the product of the glacial ice, which pushed the island up from the depths of the Baltic Sea. The chalk was formed in the dinosaur age from the tiny lime shells of plankton. Under the pressure of the glaciers, this material grew to become the distinctive chalk cliffs. The warm period covered the chalk with a thin layer of plant matter. The roots of the plants cling to the soft substratum. Without this protective covering, the surf and rainfall would have long since washed the island away. After the end of the last ice age, the climate warmed up very quickly. The forest returned, and along with it, the animals we still know today. The people, who up until this time had been nomadic hunter-gatherers, now began to settle and shape their environment. But as human civilization took its baby steps, entirely new conflicts arose. Wildlife was no longer just a food source. For a farmer tending her fields at the dawn of agriculture, deer were pests to be driven off. For the hunters, the farmers and their fields were alien intruders. They chopped down the forests and disrupted the hunting grounds. Agriculture, however, won through in the end. With what is known as the Neolithic Revolution, mankind began a targeted campaign of adapting nature to its own needs. Villages and later cities were built, and the population grew apace, because people were no longer dependent on what they could hunt and gather, but could now produce their own nutrition. The wildlife avoided human settlements, retreating ever deeper into the forests. Today's broad, open marshland habitat, on the other hand, offers little protection. But it is here that migratory birds gather each year to start their journey south. The flat, almost treeless land provides a good view for predatory birds, such as the marsh harrier, who aim to take full advantage of the situation before the summer guests move on. When temperatures have dropped and the migratory birds have flown off on their way, things go quiet on the North Sea coast, the world's largest marshland area. The place seems as remote and uninhabited as it was 2,000 years ago. Vast forests now cover the majority of Western Europe. But along the Rhine, modern civilization advanced all the way up to the north. After conquering part of the Germanic settlement areas, the Romans right away began building a supply and road network. The division, surveying, and administration of Germania began. Thanks to a sophisticated measurement technique, the Roman roads cut across the landscape in perfectly straight lines. These roads connected the Roman camps that later developed into cities, including Cologne, Mainz, and Koblenz. Off the beaten track first laid down by the Romans, modern-day Germany is thinly populated. If the forest were still left to its own devices today, it would cover almost the whole of Europe. But where human beings live and intervene, fruit orchards, fields, and pastures have supplanted quite a bit of forest area. New habitats have been created. Here, sheep, cattle, and agricultural machinery prevent the forest from reclaiming the land. The stork likes to be in close proximity to human settlements and is the beneficiary of a regularly occurring massacre, picking tasty tidbits from the field in the aftermath. Mankind repeatedly carves out a place for itself in nature. Until the early 19th century, wood was the most commonly used material, and practically the only heating material. Entire regions were deforested. By this time, the bears were almost all gone. Since the Middle Ages, the forest had been used as a grazing pasture, and the leaves blanketing the forest floor were cleared to use as straw in the stalls of livestock. Wood and charcoal supplied the energy to fire the ovens of the salt, iron, and glass industries. More and more charcoal burners and piles were set up to produce wood charcoal, huge amounts of which was needed to feed the booming nascent industries. Where wood supplies ran low, communities and cities passed laws to protect the forests. Nobility, too, took action against the deforestation. The landed gentry laid claim to huge forest areas and took measures for forest and wildlife conservancy, but not from ecological conviction. The hunting classes wanted to save their stately game reserves from destruction. Without the sport, hunting of the titled toffs, the German countryside would look a lot different today. For millennia, The hunt was an existential necessity for human existence. But in the early Middle Ages, it became a privilege. Nobility passed an edict over its forests. The farmers were not only prohibited from hunting, they were not even allowed to kill the game when it was caught plundering the harvest in the fields. At that time, there was a law that revoked the land rights of the peasantry as soon as the trees and shrubs on it grew high enough to reach a rider's spurs. Nowadays, the hunt not only serves to control the game population, it's also a popular recreational activity. A certain forest in eastern Germany does not owe its existence to nobility. Legend has it that the Spray Forest, with its tangle of countless waterways, is a work of the devil. In fact, this labyrinth of water and woods is a legacy of the Ice Age glaciers. Here, concealed in the maze of streams, the black storks raise their young. They live on little fish and frogs that they have to share with the snakes. The spray forest alder tree no longer grows in the natural way alone. The seeds that fall into the watercourses are fished from the surface and then planted in the ground. The spray forest of today no longer bears any resemblance to its primeval forerunner. Man reshapes landscapes that had developed over millions of years. 100 million years ago, exotic animals lived in the narrow estuary of what is now the border of Germany and the Czech Republic. Their chalk shells and skeletons sunk to the riverbed, collecting there, layer by layer, millimeter by millimeter. This chalk, as well as the sand and stone deposited here by the wind and waters, piled up to create mighty sandstone cliffs. When the ocean retreated, erosion took to the sandstone banks and turned them into the jagged Elba sandstone mountains. Diving down between the cliffs, along the various rock strata, is like time traveling through the geological eras of the European continent. And construction is ongoing as streams and waterfalls continuously change the rock face. As far back as the 11th century, people began mining sandstone. Later, with the development of shipping on the river, quarries sprung up along the Elbe. The quarrying widened the narrow Elbe Valley at several points. Rock for rock, the stone was broken and blasted from the walls. Shipped along the Elbe, the stone blocks arrived to build the walls of many magnificent, sacred, and stately buildings throughout the world. Elbe sandstone is still quarried today and shipped to customers around the globe. Dresden's master builders, old and new, have eroded the Elbe cliffs. For the reconstruction of the historic Frauenkirche, they returned once again to the old sandstone quarries. The Hamburg Town Hall is built of Elbe sandstone, as are many other buildings in this urban landscape. The falcons brood here, as they do in the cliffs of the Elbe sandstone mountains. The animals have long since made themselves at home in the man-made habitat. Today's major cities are anything but hostile to life. They often offer a greater diversity of habitats than the surrounding countryside. The iconic cathedral and Rhine bridges are unmistakable landmarks of the Cologne cityscape. Tourists, floods of people, concrete, and heavy traffic. You don't think of animals here. But the urban centers don't just attract human beings. Animal immigrants from across the globe have made a new home for themselves in the metropolis, adding color and variety to the scene. Our contemporary cities bring Europe's long journey of transformation to a conclusion for now. Our journey is over, but Europe will travel on for a long time to come. We'll never know what direction it will take in the future, whether it will one far-off day come to rest at the North Pole or under the equatorial sun. We won't be there to see if it gets clamped between two continents and lifted way up high, torn in pieces that sink into the sea, or covered by a kilometer-thick armor of ice. But one thing is certain, it will be an utterly different Europe than the one we know today.